So I am delighted to have the chance to introduce Rabbi Mary Zamore. Rabbi Zamore is the executive director of the Women's Rabbinic Network, which is the international organization representing Reform women, non-binary, and gender fluid rabbis, of which there are more than 850 who have been ordained.
Yeah, 860.
860. Since women and non-binary and gender fluid folks became ordained more than 50 years ago, but we're going to hear much more about that this evening. Rabbi Zamore has been the executive director of WRN for 8 or 9 years? 9 years. She is the editor of The Sacred Exchange, Creating a Jewish Money Ethic, as well as The Sacred Table, Creating a Jewish Food Ethic. Those are excellent books with so much to learn. She teaches all over at synagogues, JCCs, community organizations all over the country, virtually and in person again now. And before joining WRN as our executive director, she, and I say our because I'm one of the co-presidents of WRN, before that, Rabbi Zamore served congregations in Westfield, Morristown, and Washington, New Jersey. One amazing accomplishment of Rabbi Zamore's during her time with WRN has been to co-found the Reform Pay Equity Initiative, which is an initiative, I think the only initiative to bring together all 17 reform movement organizations into one effort working toward pay equity and just work practices in the reform movement, including the corollary issues of family leave and other issues that impact pay equity and work equity. And she also co-founded our Safe Clergy Employees and Employers program, which focuses on training seminaries at all levels within the seminary and training seminarians in the Jewish world to as future employees and employers to help create safe, respectful, and equitable workplaces. And I will also say that Rabbi Zamore's efforts through Me Too, the time of Me Too, and a recent kind of more recent wave of Me Too revelations and impacts during COVID, not that everything happened then, but it came out then, and helping the reform movement, really guiding the reform movement in a reckoning and learning process and teshuva process through that has been transformational work in the Reform Jewish world. So speaking personally, I am one of the many co-chairs of the Rabbi Mary Zamore fan club. And she's a dear friend, and I think one of the rabbis doing the most powerful work in the Jewish world at this time. And so just super excited to have the chance to learn together and to share her with all of you.
Yeah, well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. And I was with the Valley Beit Midrash in January 2020, right before the pandemic, when I came and spoke about the Sacred Exchange and some of that material. So it's a pleasure to be back and with Temple High and with all of you. We're going to dive into some of the history of women in the rabbinate. This was billed as highlights of the last 50 years. But I'm going to go a little wider than that by a couple thousand years. So I hope you don't mind. Because I think it's important to kind of see where we were to where we are and to see that contrast. Think about, when did you first recollect seeing or meeting a woman who's a rabbi? So just think of that for yourself. It's been 50 years and certainly to, children and young adults growing up today, they don't know a time without women who are serving as rabbis. But, many of us can actually remember the first time we met someone who was female identified and a rabbi. So
Rabbi Mary.
Okay, Rabbi Mary.
She's the first one. Yeah.
WRN member, proud WRN member. We featured her and her sisters a couple of years ago in some nice videos that you can see online. Okay.
my rabbi, Amy Perlin, who many of you met
Mhm.
at my installation. But,
Mhm.
I was one of the ones who got to grow up with that as the norm.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very different. And I knew about Rabbi Prisan, but in terms of like meeting face to face, it was actually after I decided I wanted to become a rabbi. I hadn't begun my studies yet, but I went to services at Stephen Wise Free Synagogue in New York City and saw Helene Ferris, who was her first. We're going to talk a lot about first tonight. So her first was that she was the first second career older rabbi to study as a second career. And as she tells the story, she was like a suburban housewife and no one ever thought she'd get through rabbinical school. And of course she flourished and is an amazing role model for all of us. And to see her on the bima, middle of New York City was pretty moving. We're going to go to another, we have someone in the chat. Maybe I see the chat number went up. So let's see I don't know if somebody answered my question there. So Alex, if you see something on the chat. Okay,
someone just said, Aglaya said a friend I met online was her first recollection.
Very, very nice. Okay, so this raises the question, which is kind of like, what is a rabbi? Right? So we can answer that question in a lot of ways, right? In terms of function, what do rabbis do? What is the history of this title, Rabbi, Rav, the Israel, Rabbi in Israel? What is that? Or what does that look like? So we're going to just see, I have a little hobby. It's a little harder now because the way search engines work. So because they pick up everywhere you've been in those cookies, right? And the algorithms and start to integrate places in the way you see the world. So I find when I do this on my home computer, it doesn't work. So I have to get like a fresh computer that's never interacted with the Jewish world. And then we see this. These are the images I get, right? And of course, studies show us about implicit bias that you can be the most ardent feminist on earth. That's a person of any gender who believes in radical equality between human beings and not think you have any implicit bias, but every single test shows us that actually we do, because there are certain imprints about the way we've grown up with bias and with images that we see, right? These images. And so whether you're talking about a surgeon, a lawyer, a leader, a president, like whatever it is, these are the imprints that our neurons in our brains have. So it's important to keep that but what's the commonality here?
Hasidic, like beards.
So you would think they're all Hasidic, but technically they're not. Like Rabbi Jonathan Sachs is Orthodox, which is not Hasidic technically. So that is actually different. But you're right, all beards, right? What else?
They're all Ashkenazi.
All Ashkenazi. All, no one said the obvious. They're all men.
Men.
Right? All what else? Older.
Much older.
White. Right? So, again, if you do this in my search engine on my computer, now that things have changed the way search engines work, you see a lot more diversity in those, in the everything we just like the diverse, like in every way, shape, or form. Okay, so here, when we talk about rabbis, and we're part of the trust of what it means to the chain of tradition, right? Kabbalat Torah, that here in Pirkei Avot, we have this beautiful line of Moses receiving the Torah at Sinai and transmitting it to Joshua, and Joshua to the elders, and to the elders, the prophets to the men of the great assembly. So that, here we have this idea of chain. And when we talk about being rabbis, we talk about being part of that chain. But of course, when you look at these roots, again, where's our part of the story? Right? So that's what we're going to try to uncover here as we go forward. So where does that road begin? So, okay. So who is this? Does anybody know?
That's Sally Prisan.
That's Rabbi Sally Prisan. Exactly. Okay. So now we're getting trickier with the questions. Ordained in 1972. Okay. Here's a more important question. Where does she live? New Jersey.
I was just gonna say Jersey.
A great place to
A
live.
great place to live, exactly. Okay. So we're not going to go back physically to the other slide, but Rabbi Sally Priesand, why is she important? Ordained in 1972.
Isn't she the first one in the United States to be ordained?
Okay, so that's one way to communicate her achievement. We're going to talk about what that, right? Like what is the language actually, and it's actually quite disputed, right? This is a hot topic at WN. So the first woman ordained in the United States. Maybe, let's say maybe. Okay. Any other stabs at this? Okay, so then who is this woman and why would I be showing you her? So she's Rabbi Regina Jonas, ordained in 1935 in Nazi Germany. So how could it possibly be that we talk about 50 years of women in the rabbinate? Shouldn't we be talking about almost 100 years of women in the rabbinate? So the problem is, well, we're going to find out more about her story in a little bit. So I'm going to leave her there. But the way we communicate this difference is that Rabbi Jonas was ordained and privately ordained. Even we're going to hear more of her narrative and how she studied in a seminary, a liberal seminary, again in Berlin. It's like mind-blowing. And was ordained privately because the seminary wouldn't ordain her. So we talk about her as being the first known, this is important, known woman to be ordained privately, but it didn't create a path to the rabbinate. Now we of course think about all the what ifs. What if, the Holocaust hadn't happened? What if she hadn't perished in the Holocaust? So she, maybe there would have been more of a path sooner. But it took another 50 years for that path really to open up. And Rabbi Priesand, those of us who are a little bit closer to her, a little bit maybe biased, we like to be very pointed with that language and not say that she's the first woman ordained in America, which is of course true, but the first woman publicly ordained, and therefore the first one at the beginning of the path of women in the rabbinate. And then to even make the further argument, it's not just women, it's about people of all different types of beautiful identities. And it's actually not just about rabbis. It's about sharing Jewish leadership widely with people, not only rabbis, but also cantors and educators and temple presidents and volunteers and lay leaders, and what it means to be in partnership among a broad, diverse, beautiful Jewish community. So that's really the underlying message here. And again, we're seeing that what is the chain of our tradition, right? We saw the other chain, Moses and Joshua and the elders, but here we can go, for instance, to Deborah. I'm not going to sit here and read the whole thing to you. Many of you know the story of Deborah. If you don't, you please, Google her, go to the Book of Judges, the original Google, and and see. But she was a prophet. She was a military leader. She was a wise person. So was she a rabbi? Well, they didn't have rabbis. This is not the age of rabbis. This is the age of prophets. But we saw that in the chain of tradition of those early nascent roots into what we became as Jewish leaders. So she's in this. And so we have examples. And, if we were going to have some wild fun tonight, I could ask all of you to write the names of all the women in the Bible that you could think of, right? And maybe we collectively we could get pretty far, but, Tamar Ashkenazi, one of our great professors at Hebrew Union College and a rabbi and a W member, that, has a whole list. And when you look at those lists, you're like, wow, I had no idea they're all there. But sometimes they're there in the shadows, right? Sometimes they're there as the wife of Noah. Even though she's given a name by the rabbinic tradition, we don't know her name in the original text. And then there are other women like Miriam, comparison, those two people. Here's another name that pops up in terms of what are our roots? What is the breadth of women's leadership that we see throughout the ages? Here we see Beria, so very well-known name, Rabbi Meir's wife. And again, we're not going to study this text. If we were in a different setting, we would have lots of fun studying this text. But she makes a halachic decision and teaches her husband in this text. And again, so then you think to yourself, well, what is a rabbi, right? But here she's not in the chain of tradition. So she's outside, but with the functionality of the rabbi. We're going to see other women like this. So here's the punchline and modern rendition of her. So here she gives the final judgment. And now we're going to meet someone else. So now we're going to skip. Remember all those white men who are Ashkenazi. Okay, so we can tell the story in many different ways. So Sigal Samuel recently wrote a book. It came out during the pandemic, I think even in 2020 or 21, called Osnat and Her Dove. And she says it and her publisher says, the true story of the world's first female rabbi, okay, Osnat Barzani. And here we go to 16th century Mosul Kurdish, right? So like modern day Iraq and that area. But I think the importance here is whether or not we can say she was a rabbi, is that there is a story extant told from generation to generation in that Jewish community about a woman who had a lot of power in a very unique way. So her story is that her father ran a yeshiva, and for whatever reason, she was always by his side studying, and nobody prevented her from studying. So she soaked up every bit of Torah knowledge from her father and the yeshiva atmosphere. And she married a great student of her father's. And then unfortunately a plague came and killed the husband and killed the father. And there's a whole yeshiva full of people studying, men studying. And she took over. And this is a theme we'll see throughout the ages of these women who were in positions, and when there was no men to teach, they had been there all along and they stepped forward. But what's unusual about this is that they accept her. They take her as the rabbi. Right? She's not ordained in that classic sense. She's not perhaps given that title in her age. That's disputed. But there is the story that shows her power. And, it's not so funny anymore because we study these stories and we learn like these rabbis in ancient times were expected to blot out plagues, right? So the old days, like I used to joke about plagues, like it's not funny anymore to us on this side of the pandemic. So a plague comes and she saves everybody. So, and this is a common theme throughout rabbinic lore in general, either saving the community from a plague or a drought. Again, Arizona, not so funny anymore. And Rabbi Siegel, you're only a year and a half, but get on it. And
top priority.
Exactly. Or non-Jewish local rulers who are trying to kill people. Again, not so funny anymore. I'm just happy that's actually not part of the list of things I'm supposed to be doing as a rabbi in modern ages, but not so funny. Just a quick mention of Hannah Rachel Vermara, the maiden of Ludmir, many different names. So she is the daughter of a Hasidic master. She has a husband who's a Hasidic master, and there's a Rebbe that she's actually follows, and she studies almost like in a transgender, non-binary type of way, where she identifies as one who should not get married and who just should study Torah and kind of shunts aside the identity that she's supposed to have in her Hasidic community in the 19th century. And finally, her family convinces her to go with a meeting to the Rebbe, who convinces her to get married, and she does. And I think he too dies. I can't remember exactly, but it's possible he too dies. A lot of disease back then. Again, not so funny anymore. And she actually again teaches other people. She makes Aliyah, goes to Israel, opens a yeshiva, and has male followers. Again, not running rampant, but becomes a Hasidic rabbi, basically. Again, not with the title, but whoa, right? Whoa, exactly. It's mind blowing. Okay, again, with this question, okay, who is a rabbi? What is a rabbi? What does this mean? So in this time period, just to remind you, in 1884 was the Seneca Falls Convention. So important step in the ongoing liberation of women, especially in America, and feminism. And here, Ray Frank was a journalist. She was out west in San Francisco. It was the high holidays. She goes to the Jewish community thinking that she'll go to services, and hard to believe there is a split in the Jewish community, and they can't figure out how to actually merge and come together for the holidays.
Shocker.
And she basically steps forward and helps heal the moment. And they know of her great oration. They know of her great writing. And I guess she was really shined at the moment. And they said, well, okay, well, we'll come together for services, but only if you speak. And so she ends up giving the sermon for the high holidays, and they ask her to stay for Yom Kippur. And so, but the papers run rampant with the story in this first woman rabbi, right? But the thing was, Ray Frank actually did not believe that women should be rabbis. She did not believe that women should work after they got married. So it wasn't like she was some rabid feminist but she was actually, because this was the age of great orators who would go from town to town and get these huge audiences. She did that, and you had to buy tickets to hear her speak on Jewish topics. I mean, this was really quite a phenomenon. But she got married later in life, and true to her word, never went out in public again in a professional capacity, never spoke again. So what I say, not a rabbi, not a real rabbi. No, some of these others I'm ready to say, go for it, girlfriend. No, not this one. Okay. We're going to do like a little bit of a jump now and come to the 20th century. And in Stephen Wise, I actually mentioned Stephen Wise Free Synagogue before, in New York City on West 65th Street off of Central Park West, there's one building, and that's where Stephen Wise, the remote cousin of Isaac Mayer Wise, the founder of Reform Judaism in America, Stephen Wise founded his synagogue under the banner of freedom of the pulpit. He was a great leader in American Judaism, and he opened a non-denominational seminary, which again, mind-blowing, right? This is another woe, because you think that is an extraordinarily modern thing, non-denominational liberal seminary, because we have so much of that today. But no, this actually was happening back in the 1920s. And so he opened this, and in the opening of that seminary, they said that they would have female students and that they would ordain women. Okay, but saying you'll do it and doing it, of course, are different things. Mm-hmm. And guess what? Nope. So there were several students. Here are all of them. And Regina Jonas, no, that's the transition to the next part of history, but we already got a glimpse of her.
What is JIR?
So JIR is Jewish Institute of Religion. So today it's Hebrew Union College - Jewish Institute of Religion. They merged in 1950. Okay. So, and now that building went back to Stephen Wise Free Synagogue. The campus went down to West 4th Street, where it is now the New York campus of HUC JIR. But back then, this was a non-denominational liberal seminary with a slant towards, of course, Zionism and all sorts of things in the liberal world. And so these were the different female identified students at that time who were in class with the men. Now, there were tracks for women to be, of course, what do you think women were becoming? You all know. This is in a Jewish school. Teachers, educators, right? The education track, that's where, of course, all the women always went and were directed. And so these women that are listed here, Martha, Irma, Dora, and Helen, all hoped to become rabbis. And they often took the same classes as the men and excelled. But the one who really, really shined was Martha Newmark, monitor her maiden name. that I think I may have done that backward. Monitors her married name. She went to every single class. No, I'm doing that wrong. I'm sorry. Let me do that backwards. Helen's the one who went to JIR. We're going to come back to Martha in a second. Helen is the one who went every single class, did better than all the men, and they just kept letting her study and study and study. And she kept going, aren't you going to ordain me? Aren't you going to ordain me? And the answer from Stephen Wise was no. And so after something like 9 years of study, they finally came up with some, frankly, totally false, special certificate to acknowledge all the study she did and denied her ordination. So that's that story. But now we're going to discuss Martha Newmark. So this is kind of parallel now that in 1921, I apologize, I just did this backwards. 1921, Martha Newmark was a very precocious teenager. Her father was a professor at the Cincinnati campus of Hebrew Union College. Back then, it was the only campus of Hebrew Union College. And he had, as many of the professors did, again, this is like what is new is old and old is new. He had a pulpit on the side in a vacation community where fancy people from Cincinnati would go in nice weather and especially the summers. And she would go with him. And after, as a young teenager, she would help lead things in this congregation. And first, it was a little kerfuffle about it. And then people were like, oh, she's pretty good. And so then she entered Hebrew Union College, and he again, there were women on campus. It wasn't that it was unusual to have a woman on campus. And it wasn't unusual to have extraordinarily young students because there were different ways to enter Hebrew Union College so that you were doing your undergraduate work and a track to graduate work. And she did this. And then she started taking the classes again with the rabbinical students. And it came for the time for the high holidays, and they all got student pulpits. And there was a shortage of rabbis, again, nothing new under the sun. And she said, how about me? Can't I have a student pulpit? And so this just created all sorts of, challenges. And so what happened is the question started to come up first, can she have a student pulpit? And would they ordain her? And in the meantime, she keeps studying and studying and studying. And of course, these things took years because it's a bureaucratic mess. And the HUC decided to throw it to the Central Conference of American Rabbis. And so they were meeting in Cape May, New Jersey. A theme. And so, and what this was, Cape May is a beautiful area, a really well-known vacation area during this time period. And interestingly enough, the site of many Christian revival meetings. So I don't know why they were in Cape May. It's kind of a little quirky and odd. And is a dry community, by the way, also to this day.
To this day.
Right, because of the religious underpinnings of this community. So I don't know why they were in Cape May, but not as much fun if they had perhaps gone somewhere else. But anyhow, and so they had this meeting. So in June 29th, 1922, so this is very parallel to JIR forming and deciding all this stuff about how they're going to treat their female students. They have one after another trying to get into that rabbinic track and failing. This is happening in Cincinnati, but in the meantime, in Cape May, New Jersey, they decide to have this. But because at these conferences, especially to such a gracious place like Cape May, New Jersey, in nice weather in June, they brought their wives. The male rabbis brought their wives. And so they decided to have this resolution. And they decided at some point to table it in order to invite all the women present, the wives, to come in and for them to weigh in, not to vote, but just to give their opinion about if a woman could be a rabbi, which is really historic. Again, nice grab for power. I love this part. And so with all of that, they actually voted yes. And so But the HUC Board of Governors said, no, we're not going to ordain you. And so even though she had completed 7.5 years of the 9-year curriculum, she eventually gave up and withdrew. And even though the CCR said, yes, we could have a woman rabbi, and they would accept the woman, because the HUC was basically hoping the CCR would say no, because the CCR would say, no, we won't accept women into our ranks, that we won't support this, but they didn't. But on the other hand, it took another 50 years for it to happen. Mm-hmm. So you have to also wonder how invested people were in that, right, that process. But interestingly enough, across the Atlantic in Germany, really in a similar time period, Regina Jonas was starting her very long studies. And now this is the part that is extraordinary, because again, about 50 years later, Sally Priesand, and you have basically, we've seen a lot of parallel stories here. But this is, to me, the most extraordinary parallel story. So she just grows up, just wants to be a rabbi. Nobody in any of these stories, by the way, wakes up one day and says, you know what? I'd like to be historic. I'd like to break barriers. Every one of these people wakes up and does the same thing that we did, that Rabbi Siegel and I did, and just say, I want to be a rabbi. I want to be part of Jewish leadership. Mm-hmm. And so she did go to the liberal seminary in Berlin, and she studied and studied. And at that time, the head rabbi of the seminary supported her and said, yes, one day you could be a rabbi. But assigned to her for her rabbinical thesis to study and make the argument whether or not women could be ordained, which is insane. Talk about like women and disadvantaged people having to do the hard work. She had to write the 100-page thesis. And it's actually, today there's a wonderful biography that you can read that has with the full translated thesis in the back of it. And we have a colleague who's a WRN member who's working on another biography that will be out between 1.5 to 2 years with all of her papers. So she writes this thesis, and in the meantime, her mentor, her supporter, her promoter dies, and they appoint a new head to the seminary, and he says, no, we're not going to ordain you. So one of her mentors ends up ordaining her privately. And what's interesting is that there's a document where Leo Beck says this has happened. He doesn't say, I support it. He was the head of the community. He was the official head of the German Berlin community. And so, but he does say it happened. But of course, the backdrop is that the show is happening, and men, including the rabbis, are either being deported or they're fleeing. And this leads a void in the community. So originally she led in ways of being at Jewish day school and being a teacher and being a pastor in ways that were socially more acceptable ways to be a female identified rabbi. But as men were missing from the community, she started to actually be on the bima and start to preach and things like this. And then she was deported with her mother to Theresienstadt, and then later to Auschwitz. And there she perished, 1944, on Parshat Bereshit. So that is when the first Torah portion of the year, right after Simchat Torah, that's when we mark her yahrzeit. So that's where her story ends. And our colleague, Rabbi Offenberg, now has more documentation about her yahrzeit, actually. So we're going to now go to a better narrative, a happier one. Just I want to mention Paula Ackerman is another interesting person. In 1950, her husband, the rabbi in the pulpit, dies, and she's the Rebbitzin, and she takes over the whole pulpit and runs it for a whole bunch of years. There's always, the question came to HUC whether or not they would call her rabbi and permit her to be ordained, and the answer was no. So this is a graphic that our colleague, Rabbi Rachel Behrman, made for So we started to do a whole run up to the 50th anniversary, and we started a whole year in advance, and the reform movement joined us, and many people throughout the world, and actually people are still celebrating, which is super cool. And so Rabbi Presand's story starts the exact same way that Rabbi Yonas's story, just a young woman who's inspired by her Judaism and says, I want to be a rabbi. And as a teenager starts writing to Hebrew Union College to ask whether or not they would take her as a student. And we have those letters right there in the archives. Unfortunately, we don't seem to have the answer, right? She said they think they have some of them they don't have.
Right, yeah.
It's been a little controversial whether or not the school's answer actually exists. I mean, of course, they've existed at some point, but whether or not we still have it. And so, again, they had a program where you could enter early, part of your undergraduate with the University of Cincinnati, and you could study there and Hebrew Union College kind of in a track together, and then just swing right into the rabbinical program. And so she did. And we've heard both from her directly and from other extant evidence and from people who were contemporaneous witnesses to this. The school was hoping that at some point she would just get married and leave. And they literally, she had a boyfriend who was in the program, and they literally went to him and just marry her already so she'll go away. Jeez. And she made the very conscious choice. And I mean, most of us are of the age that that back in the day, the woman got married, she was expected to step away from her professional career for the most part. And certainly a trailblazing moment like this, especially too. Rabbi Presand consciously made the choice to never get married so that she could take on this role in history and to do what she was really built to do, which is to be a rabbi. And interestingly enough, she ended up serving at Stephen Wise Free Synagogue on West 65th Street as the assistant and an associate rabbi. And her senior rabbi had a horrific stroke, unfortunately, Rabbi Klein, and survived, thank God. And she would push him around and assist him in every way, and really took over all the duties of the senior rabbi during that time period. When Rabbi Klein, I think, died, I don't think it died finally, the synagogue refused to make her senior rabbi, even though she had been running the synagogue for a bunch of years. And at that point, she actually almost left the rabbinate, and she called her mentors at Hebrew Union College and everybody and said, I don't think I can do this anymore. And they said, no, you don't understand, you have to. You actually have to. And they finagled things and got her a job in Elizabeth, New Jersey. And it was very part-time, and it was mixed with a lot of pastoral care at a local hospital. She was miserable because it was not the way she had expected things would play out. And then Monmouth Reformed Synagogue in Monmouth, New Jersey, near the shore, not too far from Cape May, hired her, and she had a very, very full career. She's their emerita. And they are just, her lifeblood, really. But we consider her like our true matriarch because of the sacrifice she made in so many ways in the path that she did. But we talked about the language very consciously of opening doors, because one of the gifts that Rabbi Presand has done is that she has nurtured every generation, not only of female identified rabbis, but anybody who didn't look like that Google search. Mm-hmm. She has always been the first one to reach out to the student who was the first rabbi of whatever color, or the first person of any identity, and say to them, I did it, and so can you do it, and continue to offer that mentorship. So that image of holding open a door was so true to her. And one of the fabulous things that we were able to accomplish for the 50th anniversary is that Behrman House Publishers created a children's book called Sally Opened Doors, Open the Door. So we're done by Rabbi Sally Sasso. And so here's my little list. And actually, I could have kept going with many firsts. So we talked about Sally Presand. And here I said first woman in America. We discussed, how we could maybe say that other ways. Rabbi Sandy Sasso, first woman ordained in the Reconstructionist, we used to call that, movement, 1974. So this coming year is her anniversary coming up. 1975, first woman ordained, that should just be first woman cantor ordained, Cantor Barbara Osfeld by Hebrew Union College Reform Movement. 1985, conservative movement, Amy Alberg. First woman rabbi ordained in the state of Israel, Rabbi Nama Kalman. We know her as Nami. She was the long-time dean of the Jerusalem campus of Hebrew Union College and just retired at the beginning of this year. But let's talk about orthodoxy. So Mimi Fagelson, privately ordained, 1994 by Shlomo Karbach. We also have to mention, of course, Shlomo Karbach carries a very mixed legacy, one of horrific sexual abuse and harassment, and also good things like this. So very mixed bag there. 2006, Haviva Ner, it's been a long 2 days. Haviva Ner David, first woman or publicly to receive Orthodox rabbinic ordination. This is been very controversial about how it is and how this, there are many different ways to see her ordination. But she left Orthodoxy and now calls herself a post-denominational rabbi. She does amazing peace building, B'ezrat Hashem, in Israel with her Arab neighbors. She does interesting, innovative mikvah work. She's an accomplished author. And strangely enough, we were in college together, but I didn't know her at the time, and I really wish I had.
She's awesome.
She is awesome. 2006, Rabbi Elliot Kupla, first out publicly transgender rabbi to be ordained at HEC again. 2009, and this is really the dividing line for the Orthodox world, that Sarah Hurwitz, rabbi now known as Rabbi Surah, ordained by Rabbi Avi Weiss, who also, of course, I believe ordained Shmuley, and together they founded Yeshivat Maharat. Her title shifted for a short time as people reacted in the Orthodox world. I think she has spoken for the Valley Beit Midrash many times. She's a great friend to WRN, and of course, what they are doing now there for all these years is absolutely phenomenal and wonderful. And I have done programs at Yeshivat Maharat to support those women and their students and their alumni, and they are at the forefront of that ongoing evolution and revolution. First African-American Rabbi Eliana Alyssa Staton. She was just at our convention with us and an active WRN member. So it's 2009 also, and 2017. The 100th Israeli Reform rabbi ordained in the Reform movement, who happened to be a woman and happened to be the daughter of Nama Kalman. So that's a nice little line there. And I should have on this list that in 2022, the first publicly out non-binary rabbi ordained by Hebrew Union College. So the evolution continues. I want to mention, especially at this moment in Jewish history over the last 2 weeks, we have so many Reform colleagues and colleagues in Israel. And so many of the Reform colleagues in Israel who are members of Maram, that's their rabbinic organization, ordained by Hebrew Union College, so many of them are female identified and are members of WRN. And they are out in communities in extraordinary ways with very, very little funding. I think of our colleague Yuval, I can't remember her last name right now, who serves the Gaza envelope, and has been doing funeral after funeral after funeral, and other colleagues who have stepped forward to help her because the volume has been so horrific, who are giving strength to their communities during this time. They are true pioneers, and are in areas where they're the only. Think of Mary Gold, who went through all those court fights in Israel to be able to have funding, state funding for her Jewish community. They're just one after another who have just done extremely heroic things in Israel. I know personally, I've been ordained over 26 years. And when I used to go to Israel years ago, and I'd be on some Jewish thing, and they'd be asking, why are you here and why are you traveling? And eventually it would come out that I was a rabbi. If I had said to those, young LL, security guards, I'm a space alien. I am a kangaroo. I might as well said that. I mean, honestly, that the way they would look at me. And now I go through and they say, oh, you're a rabbi. Do you know my rabbi? And then say the name. And I mean, it's extraordinary because of our colleagues and the work they're doing. Is it perfect? No, far from perfect. We had at our last convention, extraordinary rabbis from around the world. At our convention before that during the pandemic, that was virtual. We had rabbis who were the only rabbi in the entire country. Brazil, Ukraine. I mean, these were female identified rabbis have done extraordinary things. So with so many minuses against them. And they're really incredible role models. So we're just going to jump forward, and I'm just going to quickly highlight some of the obvious. So of the challenges that we are working on. So there's Amy Alberg and Sarah Hurwitz, by the way. We talked about the Reform Pay Equity Initiative. Actually, I have to put a new slide. We just launched our new website last week, so we can do that now. So the wage gap that we have in the greater American secular world is the same in the Jewish world. And there's no reason for that. We have values. We have secular laws. We have Jewish values. There's absolutely no reason for it. And so we've been doing a lot of education work around this. We've been organizing the reform movement and trying to really break through all that bias. So here we see, and it goes across all the different types of Jewish professionals, whether they're cantors, rabbis, executive directors, administrators, of course, and among the educators, there are too many women. It's a pink collar profession, so you can't even really talk about percentages. When we talk about wage gap, I think that this slide is really instructive. This is from secular data, not Jewish data. It's important to see, like we talk about these, 81 cents per dollar a white man gets, but for the average woman in America, which basically carries over to being a Jewish professional in the reform world. But when you see this add up, and of course, there, many of you in the room know this personally, that, excuse me, it really adds up. All those pennies add up. So I've got to say, so I think many of us would like a lot more money in our pensions. These are some of the interventions we've been helping build to talk about implicit bias in hiring processes. And of course, Temple High did that before their hiring process. This really makes a huge difference. And of course, studies show that you cannot do these things one time. You can't have one person come in and talk about a wage gap. You can't have one session where we talk about, like, do we have bias? That you actually need to work on this every single day, because studies actually show that if you do the one-shot deal on this stuff, believe it or not, your bias goes up in the way it's expressed in whatever you're doing. It's horrific to think of that, because they think because you've thought you covered it, then you don't worry about it. And I think for us, frankly, it's interesting. Rabbi Goldstein talked about liberal spaces. I'll talk about liberal spaces for a moment and say, I think in some ways we are more dangerous than the people who openly hold an explicit bias. Mm-hmm. Eddie, this goes back to our conversation about anti-Semitism. Mm-hmm. That if we think we're free of we're above it, we're so above this that we think everything's fair and equal and good. I think that lets us off the hook and actually lets those biases run amok. Mm-hmm. And I think when we're able to really look in the mirror and say, you know what, it's me too. It's all of us, mm-hmm. that we all have to work on this every single day. even if you're a feminist, and even if you're a female identified, and even if you're this, and even if you're that we all have to work on these biases. So one of the things WRN has built, because paid family medical leave is not a standard thing throughout the reform world, it's not a standard thing throughout the Jewish world. Although I do see that Orthodox communities are actually a little bit better about paid leave because of such a value of having children in those communities. But so we set our standard at 12 weeks paid leave. And we are inviting people to go to our website. These are free resources. They are with model language for employee handbooks. It's with model language, with contract language, and a whole over 20 pages resource explaining it, looking at the secular data, looking at the Jewish stuff, and then through frequently asked questions. And as of yesterday, we launched on the same part of our website 2 new videos that you can sit and learn with your community about the issue. By the end of November, there'll be 2 study guide there to guide you through conversations. And there are many good resources so you can start the conversation in your community, including on how to fund it. We have done historic groundbreaking work in the Me Too space, and Rabbi Siegel mentioned this. This is our website that brings together all of this in one place. Everything that we do for advocacy is outward facing, open to the public, and free, because while we're very niche in that WRN are female identified reform rabbis, non-binary, genderqueer, that we all of our advocacy work is meant to benefit everyone in the Jewish community of every identity. That we very much want to recognize, I think, the privilege and power we have as rabbis. And we live in that really irony and that duality of the subjugation and the misogyny and bias that all of us deal with. But at the same time, the power of being rabbis and being leaders in the Jewish community. So as we try to right these wrongs, we want to make sure that we lift up everyone with us. So I always like to leave congregations and communities with a little homework when I speak on this topic. So this is my homework for you. I hope that you will observe the Yortzeit of Rabbi Regina Yonis on Parshat Bereshit. So if it's not already in your Yortzeit list, to make sure it gets added. That you review the pay of all of your employees with a pay equity gender lens and other equity lenses. And again, if you go to Reform Pay Equity, there's a whole website of resources we have there. And that you will adopt robust paid family medical leave policies for all employees, and that they're clearly communicated so people can access them. And finally, and Eddie, this is especially for you, my friend, that you will adopt ethics policies to create safe and respectful spaces in your community, whether they're in person or virtual, so that people will know at all times if something goes amiss in their interaction with your community, that they know where to report it, and that they know that they are valued b'tselem Elohim as someone who's holy in the sight of God and intrinsically holy, and that you have procedures and policies to support that.
Can I add, just since there are a lot of Temple Chai folks here and online, that this is something that is on the radar, David and my radar, and that we plan to work on through in the winter and spring. There's a big push from the URJ based on WRN's work toward encouraging congregations to create ethics code and great resources. And so that's something we're excited to do.
Yes. And for those not in the reform movement, I will say that Sacred Spaces is a wonderful resource for that and very easy to use, their Kleilim website. And I'm always a resource to every community wanting to tackle any of these issues. We have a lot of support for you in that. So I'll leave it there and invite you to any questions anybody has or comments.
It was fascinating just to know the history.
Mm-hmm.
Because all I knew was about, Rabbi Sally. That's it.
Right, exactly.
So it's this whole
right. It's mind-blowing, right? All these other women who either functioned as rabbis, led their communities, 16th century, right? But the fact that there's an extant story, there has to be some truth in there, right? That there's some sort of extent, even if someone dreamed it up, to have such a dream, right, is amazing. These other women who studied side by side with men for years and years and years, and then were denied. Rabbi Jonas, who, the parallelism to Rabbi Presand's story is amazing. And the part I left out actually is Rabbi Presand. I'm going to forget the names. It's before Rabbi Gottschalk, his predecessor. I can't remember.
Maybe it'll come to me as you talk.
That the head of Hebrew Union College said she would be ordained, and then he died. And then new rabbi came in, Rabbi Gottschalk, who has unfortunately now been documented as a horrific sexual harasser and abuser, upheld her ordination and ordained her, and was a wonderful promoter of her. So again, very mixed legacy. So, but it's startling that these two women had such parallel stories, but because of the Shoah had such different endings. Well, it's been a pleasure spending time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you to everyone on Zoom.
I'm trying to look up that name. It's going to bug me now.
I know, me too.
Thank you, Rabbi Zamore. And I also thank you to everyone on Zoom and everyone in person. It was a pleasure to learn with you.